Hello and welcome to Chasing Leviathan. I'm your host, PJ Wehry, and I'm here today with Dr. Lee Braver. Dr. Lee Braver is professor of philosophy at the University of South Florida. His main interests are in continental philosophy, especially Heidegger and Foucault, Wittgenstein, realism, and the dialogue between continental and analytic philosophy. He's the author of numerous books on both Wittgenstein and Heidegger, and it's a real pleasure to have him here today to talk about how language shapes our world. Lee, how are you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me.
So as we look at, how does language shape our world, give us a little bit of what got you interested into philosophy and life's big questions. How was that journey for you personally?
Well, in America, of course, we don't really get exposure to philosophy in high school. But I always was very curious about it. It always seemed like the kind of thing that Gandalf did. I just want to know what it was like. So when I got into college, I took it right away. I took an intro class, and we read Fear and Trembling, and that was it. It was really an unfair contest. Once I read that, it was just kind of a lightning bolt. I didn't realize that you could think that way. I had no idea that was a way people could think, and that people could do that for a living. That was pretty stunning. But really, I never kind of made a decision to pursue it professionally. Every step of the way, I just wanted more of it.
Yeah.
It was just could never, never found my fill, never got to a point where it was, okay, I've had enough. And even with individual thinkers and individual texts, it's kind of one of the things I might talk about today is, this inexhaustibility of it. All the things that I've seen other than philosophy, you get through it and you get to the end, you get to the bottom, and there it is. And even though they make more money and perhaps do more things, they are what they are, and there it is, and you got it. And philosophy just is endlessly fascinating, and it's seductive.
Yeah. I mean, I love that my audience gets to hear someone express the love and joy of philosophy like that. That's what's that inexhaustibility, that continual growth, and there's no end to the light bulb moments, to use that kind of regular phrase. And it's truly a remarkable thing.
No, I'm writing this book now, and I keep thinking, okay, now I figured it out. Now I got the idea, and then. A couple months later, it's like, oh, I had no idea what I was talking about. Now I've got it. Now I figured out. It's just remarkable. I mean, it feels like, even though it's a fairly narrow focus, it's just been, I think more than anything else I've written, just this constant Pandora's box of surprises. They just keep coming out of these totally new ways to think about things I've been thinking about for decades.
Yeah.
It's been, it's for someone outside the field, it's silly to call it exhilarating, because all I'm doing is standing there and typing and going, interesting, but it's in my mind, I'm catching fireworks in my mouth on a roller coaster, and it's just this massive, adventure. And I agree, people don't talk about that enough. In scholarship, we tend to, we present ourselves rather neutered.
Yeah.
And,
well, and you don't see the fireworks outside someone's head, right? So if you just watch somebody and you haven't gone through all the conversations and people just get lost, then they're just like, it's just people talking, and it's like, no. Like, once you understand, and you that whole idea of the great conversation, if you read through people like Kant and Heidegger, you are reading at the kind of the height of what humanity has to offer in terms of thinking, right? I mean, and there are other traditions too, absolutely, and they also are the height of but there is that level of if I'm reading this, understanding this, I am contributing, and that's it's an amazing thing.
Well, that's, in fact, this also is something we might talk about. For Heidegger, one of the ways he talks about artworks, for example, he's trying to challenge traditional ontology. In traditional ontology, one of the basic ideas is that, an object is just this spatially limited, discrete thing.
Yeah.
Right? What he called presence at hand in his early work. And he wants to reject that. He wants to question that. He wants to be open to fundamentally different ways that we can conceive of entities. And when we talk about books, these aren't just static things sitting there. They are conversation partners. They are an event for him.
Yeah.
And it's also that for example, for a piece of music, in some sense, of course, it exists just as written out. But in another sense, it doesn't exist until it's played, and even more so until it's heard.
Yes. Yeah.
And so you need all of those participants for it to come into being. And so the audience is helping birth it. They are the midwives to the existence of the artwork. And with philosophy, the reader is doing that. The thought isn't there until someone thinks it.
Yeah. Yeah. And what we've kind of already started getting into it. How does language shape our world? And you've already alluded to the art piece of it. I think of Heidegger talking about the temple is set in the forest, and I think language is very similar, and I think that was part of his point. But if you can address that, I know that's a big topic, so feel free to delineate how you want. But
this has been the fireworks that I've been working on. I'm writing in this book.
Yeah.
Let's go back to the piece of music.
Yes.
Okay. First of all, to describe it, we have to describe it as a piece of music, as a discrete entity.
Yes.
Which implies continuity over time, self-identity, discreteness. When in fact, I think Heidegger's right that it's a much better description of it to call it an event, a happening, an occurrence. Right? But secondly, if we talk about the writer, the performer, the audience, simply to discuss these things, language requires us to separate them.
Yeah.
Language requires us to talk about them as discrete entities, right? And one of the things that Heidegger talks about throughout his entire career, from beginning to end, is I call it the Humpty Dumpty thesis. And the idea is, if you're looking at a holistic phenomenon, and you break it apart in order then to look at the pieces, and then you bring the pieces back together, you can never get that initial holism again. You can't get a whole by putting pieces together. It will always be a combination of pieces. It'll always have the seams showing.
Yes.
And so he does this a lot in the order of like being in the world.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's the point of the hyphens in it.
Yes. Yeah. That's totally about even dealing. I homeschool my 4 and 6 year old, and there's so much of the world that they aren't dissecting; they're just accepting as given. And that's part of the joy of being a parent, is seeing the world fresh and whole.
Sure.
But you'll never still have that whole. You can only barely glimpse it through your children, because as an adult, everything gets pulled apart. That's why we have the whole, like you mentioned, like kind of Descartes being a whipping boy for Heidegger and Wittgenstein, and honestly most of 20th century philosophy, right? Because the idea of breaking things apart to understanding them, you lose something.
That's the analysis that he insists on for his method. I think I called him the Margaret Dumont of philosophy. Marx Brothers. Because I always like that image of him just being, I don't understand what's going on. Why are these people saying these weird things? And, for Descartes, analysis is his proposed method. We break things down to the smallest pieces. And of course, analytic philosophy took that name partially because they believe that's the way to approach things. And this way, science does it. You break problems into the smallest pieces, you distribute them, and then you bring them back together. And that works for some things, but it doesn't work for other things. Continental philosophy has been far, far more holistic in general. And I have a lot of sympathy with that. And one of the reasons why I find Wittgenstein so difficult to classify is that he's very much on the holistic side, which is always so weird when I read analytic discussions of him, because here's an argument, here's the private language argument. And I just don't think you can understand it at all without seeing it in the entire philosophical investigations. It's very much in there organically, and they rip it out as if you can read it on its own. And one of his whole points is, when you take something out of its context, it changes its meaning.
Yes.
But they're happy to do that too. It's kind of without a self-aware. But anyway, but I mean, I really do like analytic philosophy. I don't want to
it has its uses. Yeah, absolutely. But
so to go back, so this idea of language as separating, as casting, as presence at hand in his early terminology. He's trying very, very hard to fight that throughout all of his work, from early all the way to the end. And the problem is, even in order to say this is what I'm fighting, you have to talk about it in this way.
Yes,
it's an incredibly difficult problem. Even if you could get across the issue, how could you solve it?
Yeah.
What could possibly be a solution here? You can't invent an entirely new language because no one will understand you.
Yeah.
Which some people think, well, there you go. That's what happened, So he's really pushing against the strictures of grammar, trying to play with it and force it to do what he wants it to do, and draw out other possibilities from it. And this is one of the reasons why he's so fascinated by poetry, because poetry is a radically different way of using language than what we normally think of as philosophizing, theoretical philosophizing, anyway. And he's often says, I mean, at the end of one of his lecture series, he says, I failed because this whole lecture series has been a series of assertions and propositions, right? But I always think of Beckett's line, fail again, fail better.
Yeah.
All you can do is you just keep working and failing in a way that suggests.
Failing
so
forward.
I think failing forward, sure.
Yeah.
And so what I've been looking at lately is, what else could language do?
Yeah.
And the topic that I've been really fascinated with is polysemy. Okay. This idea of language expressing multiple meanings at once. So, it's a form of ambiguity, but of course, ambiguity is itself ambiguous. There are lots of different forms of it. Usually, ambiguity is potentially confusing, right? And you have to disambiguate in order to know what someone's talking about. But with polysemy, so with ambiguity, there are multiple possible meanings, and you have to be sure which of the ones the person means.
Right.
With polysemy, you mean all of them, or at least several of them at once. And what this does is this allows you to say multiple things without separating them. You can talk about various if you can find the right polysemic phrase or sentence, which Heidegger just seems to be able to do, by sitting down. He just pulls them out of his ears. It's just irritatingly easy for him. Derrida inherits this capacity. Yeah. If you can find the right ones, then they cannot just express the right thing, but express it in the right way.
Can you give us an example?
I can. And like I said, he has a bunch of them. So one of his best ones, I think, is the title of one of his lecture series. In German, it's Was heißt denken? And it's translated as what is called thinking. And the reason why I say the German is because it's ambiguous. And we have the ambiguity in English, which is nice. It just doesn't quite get there with the proposition. So heißen is call, and we have the meanings, the same meaning. So call means to call to someone.
Yes. It
means to call someone or something forth, and it means to call something a name, to give it a word. And those map on to the German. It just almost never happens.
I know. I was about to say, I was really surprised. Yeah.
Yeah. Just it's really nice that we have that. Unfortunately, it does. We need to put in propositions in different places where you don't in German, so it isn't quite there. But you get the gist of it.
Which someone reading is like, what does Heidegger mean by what is called thinking? And it's he means all of those things.
Well, so he spends.
Go ahead.
Well, he spends quite a bit of time unpacking this, about a quarter of the book unpacking it. And he says, all of these meanings are important, and he lays out four of them. One is, what has it traditionally meant? This thing, thinking. What's been called it? What is it now called? What calls forth thinking, and what does thinking call to us? Or what calls us to think. And he explores all of these at some length. And he ends up saying that the four different versions respond to each other. Right? They have this very intricate interrelationship among themselves. It's not just pure chance. This is sort of there's a dangerous way to put it, but sort of the inherent kind of wisdom of language.
I was just about to ask. Oh, forgive me, but I was about to ask: does that tie to even like Wittgenstein's talks about that logic that exists in everyday language? Is that kind of that same similar idea?
Well, it's tough to. I mean, the problem is you have to sit down and explain what Wittgenstein means by that, which of course is extremely hard to understand, and then make the connections. Certainly not in the early work, not in Wittgenstein's early work. They mean very different things there.
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
But in the late work, there's more overlap, though. Yeah. There's some overlap, I think.
All right, I'm just jumping to conclusions. Gotcha. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's a fascinating topic. That's a whole other show.
Yeah, for sure.
So if we ask, what is this thing that has traditionally been thinking? It's this kind of intentional, conscious, logical, rigorous way to find clarity, logical clarity, and it's been the key to autonomy for philosophers. Right? I think in order to take control of myself, in order to take control of my life, in order to resist the forces that are on me, that try to exert control over me. And of course, this really comes to a head with Kant, for whom thinking simply is autonomy. And if anything is causing you to think something, you're not even really thinking, because a cause can't be a reason. And that's what's traditionally been called thinking. But if we start thinking about the other sense, what calls thinking, what calls us to think, just that question turns that view around.
Yeah.
And it makes us think of it in a different way, because now the question is, well, why did we start thinking in the first place? Why do we think about this instead of that? What drew us forth into thinking? Why do we have in Kantian language, why do we have these concepts and these forms? Why do we have this drive towards autonomy? And whatever it is that you've been thinking, Heidegger wants to get kind of beneath that or before that and talk about where it came from. And of course, you can kind of do this ontically. You say, well, this thing suggested it. Well, it's that thing suggested. But of course, you have to get, above that chain and talk about the entirety of thinking as a whole, that we are called into thinking. We are allowed to think. We are enabled to think. That the idea of thinking as under our control, as our creation, as our intentional action is absurd. Right? When I think 2 + 2 equals, I don't decide, I shall answer that with 4, right? The answer calls to me.
Yeah.
It 4 pops in my head. When I see all men are mortal, Socrates is immortal, Socrates is a man, therefore, right, I think Socrates is immortal. Right? It pulls me along. This is not an active process that I'm driving. I'm writing it.
Yeah.
It's calling me through the process. The reasons are pulling me through. I'm not reasoning. I'm being reasoned through it. And so the second 2 meanings of it change and inform the way we think of the first 2 meanings of it. And now we even think of the traditional sense as itself something that got called to us. Right? The sense of us in control and us in charge of our thinking was itself something that was suggested to us, that struck us as plausible, right? that came to, that we saw as reasonable. Right? All these very passive constructions, because that's the way he sees it. And so the calling to us is, for him, what kind of underlies and explains what has been called reason, what we have called reason. And that is what we should be calling reason. And then he can point to the very process that we just went through, where what we did was listen to language. We didn't order our words to mean what we decided them to mean. We looked at and we listened to and we paid attention to these other senses rattling around in these words, which is, again, it was calling these things to us. Right? And so the very process that we went through to get to this conception of reason was itself in line with that conception of reason. Right? What we performed was what we learned, and vice versa.
So another way of describing this is kind of the process of how presuppositions get baked into the language from the start.
Well, I don't think he wants to talk about how this happened, how these meanings got into the words, right? And that's kind of where I'm a little wary of connecting with Wittgenstein. It's because then again that implies a sort of explanatory comprehension of the whole process.
Yeah.
Whereas for him, what we can grasp is always a matter of what we have cognitive access to, and that's always going to be very limited
because we're finite.
This is what he thinks is the central lesson of the first critique is our finitude, and this is what he called in the first, in meantime, our thrownness. We are thrown into this particular way of living. But in the later work, it's just being thrown into the clearing. It's being thrown into just being aware of anything at all, as well as the particular kind of awareness that we have, the way of awareness we have. So, I think a very natural question is, well, how did this happen? How come these words have these meanings that do this thing? And I think for him, that's just not a kind of question that we can get any satisfying answer to. We can't get outside of language to explain it.
because we use language to explain.
For one thing, yeah.
Yeah. Is this kind of the theme that Gadamer, Heidegger student, will pick up with the historicity of our being? Right.
Well, it's very important for historicity because Heidegger talks a lot about, he's always going back and rereading the canon, right? And he has these weird, violent readings of Heidegger, and he says there over and over. He said there are these hidden treasures in these canonical texts. So he goes back and he reads these books that we've been reading over and over and over and over again, and he finds all this new stuff in there. And people say, oh, well, that's not what so-and-so meant, and that's implausible and so on. But one of the things that we're trying to do here when we see that thinking is calling to us, when we see that language is kind of speaking to itself, is reconceive subjectivity. Subjectivity and technology for him are very intertwined because it's all about control.
Yeah.
Right. It's all about us being in charge, us making the decisions, us putting things in their place where we want them, where it's convenient, where it's usable, where it's understandable. And he wants us to let go of that. It's false. It leads to a terrible life. He didn't say this, but it's destroying the planet. It's just there's so many things wrong with it. And one of the things that we're doing when we're listening to language, when we're seeing how ideas occur to us instead of us choosing them, that's what inspiration means, is that we're trying to see our relationship to the world and to thinking in a very different way, and not as us in control. So when we look at these historical texts, we look at Parmenides, a sentence by Parmenides. If you say, well, look, that's an illegitimate reading because Parmenides didn't mean it. Number one, of course, how could that's a very difficult thing to ascertain. But number two, that means that Parmenides had full control over his words, and that they only can contain what he put into them. And that's the technological subject conception of meaning. And the logical conclusion of it is a different meaning of Humpty Dumpty, where in the actual Lewis Carroll book, he makes up meanings for words. And he says, well, the word will mean whatever I want it to mean. And he even says, Alice says something, and he goes, well, that's glory for you. Choose glory. What's glorious about that? He says, oh, by glory, I mean a knockdown argument. So, you can't mean that. You can't. No, that's what I mean by the word. I don't know what other people mean by the word. That's what I mean. So it's like this conception of language as completely pliable, as entirely an instrument. Exactly. Yes. And he says that over and over again. Right.
Going back, and again, to even
ties in technology.
Yes, I was just about to ask. I mean, like we've referenced a couple times the question concerning technology by Heidegger, and that idea, like everything you're talking about, even with the planet, with ourselves, with language, we're talking about for the process of quantification so that we can manipulate things easier. We cut things out of context, and we shave off rough corners of things that don't fit
and ambiguities.
The box. Yes, which is where it's interesting. You're talking about polysemy. I'm probably saying that wrong, but I
don't know.
That makes me feel better.
Yeah. I used to say polysemy, and then I give a paper, and the people all looked funny, and so now I say polysemy. And as far as I can tell, both are acceptable.
But. Yeah. What's great about polysemy is that it's very it really flies in the face of a lot of this, because you cannot get rid of the multiple meanings. Right. You have to accept them all at the same time. And while that's still possible to quote unquote quantify, I mean, you'll still do violence to it. It's much more difficult, and it's one of those kind of openings into inspiration, if that almost makes sense, where you can see a little bit more. Go ahead.
So you say you can still kind of quantify it except Parmenides, and there's a huge thing with Derrida, Parmenides could not have known what Heidegger would have made of it.
Right.
And so, and if Heidegger does this basic thing, which Derrida also insists on, which is finding the meanings in the words.
Yes.
A fidelity to the text, which whatever people say he does, both of them do.
Yeah.
Then those words mean that.
Yeah.
And, it's not a matter of Parmenides meaning it, it's a matter of the words saying it, because that's what we have.
Yeah.
And so, but that also means, of course, that Heidegger's reading of Parmenides contains senses that he can't predict.
Yeah.
That he doesn't know what they will mean.
Yeah.
And so there is an in principle unquantifiability, an unlimitability to it. Derrida has this wonderful. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say that's full circle back to you talking about the fireworks and then the inexhaustibility of philosophy. That's where it is it's a continual dialogue. Yeah, but continue about Derrida. Yeah.
Right. I mentioned when we were talking about that it's kind of tied into what we were talking about.
Absolutely.
But so Derrida has this wonderful phrase, and the more I read him, the more not systematic he is, but the more like he's got a lot of pieces. They all do kind of fit together, and he's not just a reader. He really has a full way of looking at everything. And temporality is very important in his work, which takes a long time to see for me to see anyway. And one of his, Heidegger says, for instance, at the beginning of time, this notion of serial moment after moment doesn't fit existence, doesn't fit the way we live. So we need a whole different notion of temporality. Well, Derrida says we need a different notion of temporality for texts. That they have a different kind of reality than the serial minute. And they have a different kind of temporality than we're used to talking about. And his expression for that is the future anterior. That's the tense. And what that is the future, but the anterior is the before. So it's the will have been tense. And so what he says is, you never know what your words will have meant. So it's the future because they will mean it when someone reads them that way.
Yeah.
But that isn't unrelated to me, because if someone can convincingly show that the words say that, then the words did mean that. And if I said it, there's some sense in which I have meant it, but I didn't know that I meant it. And so again, we're demoting the modern subject. We're showing that the subject is part of a process, not the origin and master of it. It's not that the subject has nothing to do with it. Of course, that's absurd. But I mean, this is what Heidegger does actually in the beginning of the question concerning technology, which is very, very easy to miss, where he does a brief discussion of Aristotle's four causes. And his point is that, after with the medieval discussion of God became the efficient cause that really absorbed everything else. And then with early modern, humans took over that role. But it's a much better description to talk about all four causes as interacting with each other. And this is the notion of thinking and speaking that I think he wants to put forward as us as part of a process, except, as we started with, that's too separating. Right? That's the problem with it. And so by talking about it polysemically, he's able to express it without breaking it apart and demonstrate what he's talking about in what he's saying.
Which is why my question about does this show how presuppositions get baked into language is still that pulling apart.
Right. Yeah.
Really good. Thank you so much. Do you have any more comments on that, or I have another question?
I've got a book.
Yeah. Do you have not to put any pressure on you, but do you have an end date for that? Do you have a publication date?
I have had several end dates, and they have not ended.
Oh, yeah.
Like I said, every time I think I've got a handle on it, I just discover this whole new, it's like digging, and then you think you got the bottom, and oh no, there's all these amazing artifacts and skeletons and pottery shards underneath that. And now I have to look at those. And but I'm really, really hoping I'm on my final revision now. Maybe I'll submit it by the end of the summer. But I do have a paper that summarizes some of this that's going to come out in Review of Metaphysics next year.
Okay. And what's the title of the paper? And do you have a title for the book yet?
The title of the paper is How to Say the Same Thing, or How to Say the Same. I forget which it is now. Heidegger, polysemy, and later Heidegger, maybe. Because he uses this word same to express this kind of relationship, which we didn't quite get into that, because we don't have a word for the relationship between, for instance, the meanings, the multiple meanings.
Right.
Because if we talk about them as multiple already, we're separating them too much.
Yeah.
If we talk about, Dasein has an internal connection to the world. Well, now Dasein and world are too separated to actually have that internal connection in our language. And so one of the words that he uses starting in the 50s is same. He gets that from Parmenides, thinking and being are the same. So for the way he reads that is the way that we started off with a piece of music.
Yeah.
Right. The listening and the performing are the same because they all are integral parts of the event of the music. The event of the music is this holistic, unified entity, event. And then if we kind of stop it and analyze it, literally analyze it, then like precipitates, we can take out the player and the audience and the instrument and stuff like that. But they don't have that relationship when in the playing. And the word he uses there is the same for that, which is I used to think was really annoying, but I've come to see, there's no better word for it.
Well, what else is he going to say? Yeah,
right. Exactly.
I feel like kind of floating around alongside this conversation is, we've mentioned Derrida, but I mean, that's kind of the point of deconstruction, is that when you separate things, they're often done in contrast to each other. And so then the whole idea of deconstruction is to pull apart those binaries and like fall back down and see it as a whole again. Am I thinking the right direction there? Does that kind of float alongside this current discussion?
Well, I mean, I'm going to have a chapter on Derrida on it, because I think this really brings them to, as much as they are read together, this brings them even closer together than usual. I mean, the binary, for Derrida, the most important thing about the binary is the hierarchical evaluation. He's more focused on that than their separation.
Yeah.
Whereas for Heidegger, the separation is really important. The hierarchy comes in primarily in the question of the subject.
Yes.
Because we always put the subject on top.
Very much
the
like
internal things.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, the internal things like male over female, Heidegger couldn't care less about stuff like that.
Right. But that kind of goes back to, is there a connection between question concerning technology with having like even the author over a text? And so Derrida kind of sees that as hierarchical. And I think even Heidegger says it's inappropriate for the subject to be masterful over these objects. They're all part of the same process.
Yeah. I mean, it's very important for Derrida to reduce the subject's mastery over the text. He says, this is one of the most important things he says. He says, the reason why he wants to say writing is before speech or speech is writing is because the point about writing is that it has an integral, as part of its definition, is that it operates in the absence of the author. Right? If a piece of writing requires the author to be there, then it's not operating the way it should be. The purpose of it, of course, usually is so that I can send it off to someone, or even to myself in the future to write a note for myself. But even regardless of the purpose, that's part of what writing has to be. And then he thinks that's just true of all language, that all language has to be intelligible without being kind of animated by the speaker or the writer. And once you have that, then there's no longer the author authority. There's no longer the author as the one who knows what it means and can tell you what it means, the source and control of all the meaning of it. And then the reader is just as much in determiner of the meaning of it as the author. It takes on its own life, and anyone can read it. I mean, Heidegger has this wonderful line. I think it's one of the few witty things he ever said, where he says, I have this violent interpretation of Kant. Well, there is no Kant in himself, which is really funny, because he's comparing hermeneutics, the reading of texts, to Kant's metaphysics, the idea that there's this noumenal something outside of our experience, our phenomenal experience of it. He's saying, well, he rejects that, of course, with phenomenology, but he also rejects it in terms of reading. There's no text in itself. There's just the readings of the text. And if they change, then the meaning changes. There's just nothing that we can say, oh, it has betrayed the true meaning. Because the one thing we can do is we can say, well, the words don't support that reading. That's a sort of objectivity. It's that not anything goes, stupid crap. But there is no single, there is no just capital T truth to what texts mean.
Because they're more of an event than an artifact. Exactly.
That's right. Mm-hmm. And they're an event that reoccurs in every reading.
Yes. Yeah. Because it changes. I mean, and I think everyone listening to this can understand, like, if you reread a book, right, it always changes. Because, and this is coming from, I did a good amount of work in Gadamer, but like the idea that like works of art are made in one place and then displayed in one, and now we put them in museums, and it's a totally different experience between being in the workshop, being in the home of a really rich nobleman, or being in a museum, right? And like it means something different in each case. One is
it is something symbol. Different.
Yes. One is a status symbol, in the case of like the wealthy nobleman. One is like a work of art for the artist, and then you have like this kind of heritage national treasure now, and that's even that is very simplistic, but in each case it's changing as it goes.
Yeah, and one of the things that Derrida kind of sometimes points to, that I always play up in class, is this is we all believe this. Every year there are new books on Moby Dick, on Plato, on Aristotle. If they were, if they had a single meaning, we would have found it, and someone would have read it. There it is, and there would be no more scholarship. But thank God for all these people who publish and perish. They can keep churning stuff out that's grounded into texts, and yet says something completely new about it. That's how scholarship works.
Yes, yeah.
It's just absurd to think anything else.
Yeah. It's good.
But sorry, one last thing. That's enabled by polysemy. That's why I think this word is so important too. So go ahead.
No, that's awesome. I really appreciate your time. I don't want to steal too much of it, but I did want to ask, because this is something, I'm a digital marketer for a day job, and did my master's focusing on Heidegger and Gadamer, and then I'm living in this world of the internet. Do you see anything fundamentally different about what the internet is doing in terms of context, in terms of, even fusion of horizons, but just how, because, we've talked about philosophy of language, and we've used kind of a loose definition of like, expression and communication. Is there something fundamentally different about the internet and the way that it's that even the context is almost flattened?
Well, you could also say that digital medium enables recontextualization so easily.
Yes.
That it's in a way it's actually conducive to these ideas, right? That it really helps us not think of this is what this means, this is what that means, because we, memes and so on, we just constantly see
Yes.
new ways of using the same picture, the same phrase. I mean, that's kind of the creativity challenge of this generation. I think of it generational, because my kids do it. And it's incredibly creative. I mean, I had no idea so many people were so creative. It's one of the wonderful things that's been opened up by this medium. Because, when I was a kid, you had 3 channels and you were a completely passive absorber of it unless you were one of the few people who made content. But now everyone gets to make content, and it's good. There's a lot of just really funny, interesting stuff that's done, very widely distributed. But my point is that, a lot of this is very in line with postmodern aesthetics. A lot of the work is this blurring of the line between creation and reusing, between copying and creating. It's and that's, again, when Heidegger gives one of these readings, the question, is that right? Is that what was meant? Is that the real meaning? These are questions we're trying to recognize as inappropriate. And I think that those ways of treating media help wean us off those ideas.
Obviously with memes, because the author of memes don't care that they're the authors.
I hadn't thought of that. You're right. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. They do. Like they send it out, and if it gets reused, they're happy, even though they are anonymous. It's this kind of gift to the community, and it is very much a process. It just keeps evolving, and they go off in different ways.
Or how about this? I mean, a lot of the memes are like stills from movies from the 80s or so.
Yes.
Who created that? Was it the movie?
Yeah.
Or was it the person who took the still and then turned into a meme? Where was the creation of this? I mean, it's distributed.
Yeah.
There's no single artist creator. We're getting very far away from the romantic genius notion.
Yes.
Of the ex nihilo Beethoven creator.
Yes. Yeah. It's absolutely fascinating to me, slightly off topic, but I want to bring it back. Like my 6-year-old, when he was 3, he's like, "Hey Dad, the TV's broken," because we're at my grandparents' house and a commercial came on. He didn't know, he was like, and they all, one of the things I have to do is turn off the mic on our Google Home, because they will just like talk to Google. And I use that as examples of, I have lived through a time where we're seeing like the modernist subject kind of being dissected and torn apart itself. And I'm very curious to see what it's like, because for me, I remember getting my first computer. I remember like the idea to me even of like talking to a computer is still like science fiction. And
oh yeah.
My 3-year-old, it's what he'll always know. And so I am curious. And I think the internet has basically, I mean, you can't get rid of historicity completely, right? But that idea of like the subject, it'd be really interesting to see how this generation that has not only lived with computers, that was one step, but has lived with the internet, will perceive authorship.
And, to talk about things like Alexa and Google, I mean, these are quasi subjects. We're not at the point of an AI, which could just be another subject, but because of the liminal in-betweenness, it takes away from the idea that it's this bivalent thing. Either you are a subject or you're not. And it just tears down the notion that this has a meaning. Instead it is more Wittgensteinian. It's just something that we apply depending on the circumstances. Another thought I forget now.
Oh, I grew up very much with that romantic genius idea. That's the way, like, it was, people had us read biographies and all that sort of thing. And it's funny how it threatened me at first, but then I just, I'm like, okay, I've read Heidegger and I've read Wittgenstein. I should know better, right? The Netflix by bots. I don't know if you've heard of that. But so Netflix took AI and fed them a bunch of scripts, and they made little 5-minute films based on scripts from created by AI. And it's like, I was like, I want to write my own novel someday, and I was like, oh, that doesn't count. You know what I mean? I wanted to be frustrated with that.
Yep.
And then I just realized, oh, that's just like, that's leftover historical baggage, right?
Right. That's right. There's a program, I forget, I think it might have been Google, because they're so far advanced in AI. And it's able to write newspaper articles and a lot of different genres in a way that you can't tell. I mean, the Turing test, you can't tell the difference.
Right.
It's gotten that good now.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's been dead for a long time. Like not dead, but like they figured it out. Yeah. It's really incredible. Dr. Braver, Lee, thank you so much for coming on today. Really appreciate it. If you could leave our audience with one, maybe not summary, but if there was one thing that one takeaway you'd want for them today, what would it be?
Ooh, buy my books.
Hey, that's great. Can't go wrong there. I mean, that's kind of the whole point of this is not the whole point of Chasing Leviathan is that we are pursuing truth, but we can't ever catch it. So, buy Dr. Braver's books and learn more. Engage in the fireworks. Yeah. Yes.
Engage in the fireworks. That's good. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you, sir. And really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.